Good afternoon. What I want to talk about now in the class is some particular types of offenders. I'm talking today about mainly serial killers and mass killers. Okay. So let's begin by talking about homicidal fantasies. Here's a question. How many of you have ever thought about killing someone? Who wants to volunteer?
I get a little bit.
Okay, one volunteer.
No one here.
In actuality, though, probably a lot of you are not being entirely honest. Okay, in surveys given to university students, about half generally say that they've had some sort of homicidal fantasy. I'm not talking about planning it out in detail. Okay, it's some fantasy in the moment when someone's annoying you, humiliating you. Okay, and then you're thinking about getting even with that person or whatever it might be. And first done with Kenrick and Sheets, okay, what they found was 73% of the male college students and 66% of the female college students said they had had some sort of homicidal fantasy at one point that they could write about. Okay, there's been replications of this. It only really varies by about 5%. Okay, it's 68 to 78% of males. Okay, well, 61 to 71% of female participants. 18% of them had one in the last month, and 30% of the males said they had frequent fantasies. It wasn't just an isolated case. Okay. The event that triggered this was typically some personal threat or some public humiliation. They were the most common reasons as to the triggering of these sorts of fantasies. What were the relationships? Who were they fantasizing about killing? 48% of the time it was a stranger, 47% of the time a friend, 44% of the time a step parent. They were the most common three. If you know anything about homicide relationships between a victim and offender, you might think, spouse is missing here. A decent percentage of homicides is men killing their wives or deranged ex-boyfriends. Okay. But these are college students, and what the surveys said about this sample was that most of them didn't have meaningful, steady relationships in their past that had ended in heartbreak. If it was an older sample, then you might think that X might be somewhere on the list. But most people do not act on these fantasies, right? If it is the case that about half of people have had homicidal fantasies at one point, why do only the very, very small minority actually end up acting on them, right? What's the difference, psychologically, neurobiologically, what's the difference between those who actually act on these fantasies and those who don't? When I was a PhD student, I went to a crime writers conference because my PhD supervisor was the interviewer. She was on stage interviewing crime writers, and one of them was asked where they got their inspiration for the crime book. And he just, on stage in front of everyone, laid out, well, there was this guy I wanted to kill because he was harassing my family. So I planned out how I was going to kill him, and I picked out the spot where I was going to dump the body and blah, 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 and all the other details. But I decided not to kill him. I just wrote a book about it instead. He was so open on stage about this. That's not really what I'm talking about, not that level of detail. Okay, when I talk about homicidal fantasies, what I'm talking about is, some image, okay, that you might briefly have at some point. In terms of some differences, okay, between homicidal offenders and other types of offenders, this study has over 1,500 convicted male offenders, looking for significant differences, okay, between those who had committed homicide and then the other violent offenders who had maybe committed physical assault, sexual assault, okay, some other violent crime. Some significant differences: the homicidal offenders more likely to have sold hard drugs, greater peer delinquency, more likely to have been held back a grade, have family on welfare, frequently carry a gun. Okay. Some significant risk factors for crime in general, but maybe even more the case for homicidal offenders. Okay, that's some of the differences. There is also perhaps a surprising overlap between criminal offenders and victims to homicide. Okay. 50% of homicide victims are a criminal offender themselves. Okay. In one study, even 26% of cases of homicide, it was the victim who had initiated the conflict. Okay. Whether it was a fight and they threw the first punch and then it escalated to one killing the other, or it began with some verbal assault. Okay. But whatever the conflict, act of aggression was, it was the victim who had initiated it. How might we explain this? Why is it that, well, there's such a large number of homicide victims who were criminal offenders themselves, or maybe a better way of putting it, why is it that criminal offenders maybe are more likely to be victim to homicide than the average person is? There's many possible reasons, but what's some? Yeah.
Well, in general, they've experienced that trauma too, so
Okay.
the result of that may be just symptoms of that.
Okay.
So like aggression or just more violent behavior.
Okay.
I actually read a study that a lot of people who are victims become offenders because the sense of understanding like what happened to them, they want it to become normal, so they do it to other people.
Okay. Interesting.
I know the fantasies are personal threat and humiliation. So like if an offender like publicly humiliated them by like punching them or something,
Right.
they might
Okay. Yeah.
carry out their fantasy.
Okay. Yeah.
If you're a criminal, you're probably more likely to know or meet other criminals, so that would probably explain why. Or they, in a lot of these murders, they like know each other from that kind of life.
That's probably the big one, right? It's a shared environment. We're already interacting with at-risk people, criminals, other violent people. Yeah.
Sort of similar, like if we're talking about stimulation seeking, if the victim is already someone who's a criminal and is seeking that stimulation, they may also be more likely to engage in like a fight or like some sort of physical violence that would like result in them dying.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. All good. Yeah. And then retaliation might be another one as well, kind of tied to also knowing offenders. If you've been a victim, then retaliating against that person. Victim offenders are twice as likely to be using drugs than other non-offender victims. And more likely to be using alcohol, more likely to be male, more likely to be younger. Okay. So average age of homicide victims who are not offenders is 34, 4 years younger, or offenders or victim homicides, or homicide victims who are offenders. It's also true that the majority of homicides are men killing other men, and usually for stupid reasons. For trivial disagreements, trivial disputes, whether it's some bar brawl or some other argument that gets out of hand. Yeah. You know, if you really look at criminal cases, not just the ones that reach the news or those that are in movies and so on, that you would be startled by how many homicides are just resulting from guys who were out drinking with their mates, and then they had some sort of dispute with some other guy, and it was an argument or a fight, and they wanted to look hard to their mates, and so wouldn't back down, and then it just escalated into something stupid. Most of these altercations, they result from something with a very trivial origin, okay? Some form of jealousy, some form of verbal assault or some sort of altercation. Remember, the vast majority of murders are reactive, right? They're disorganized, okay? They're not planned out, okay? So, in terms of what's different, okay, between those who actually commit crime or murder in particular, and those who maybe just fantasize about it, we've already looked at some differences, right? We've looked at the fact that the amygdala is about 9% smaller in killers than controls, okay? That might have a negative impact on one's empathy, their ability to have emotional responses, might make them more fearless, right? And we've also looked at the dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex, right? It's also apparent in murderers. Yes, there are exceptions like Randy Kraft, right? But he was the exception. Most of these killers killed once in a disorganized way and then were caught. Okay, that's the majority of killers. Okay, so they might have prefrontal cortex dysfunction that leads them to poor impulse control, difficulty with making good decisions, planning ahead. Right. So combining all of those things, right, that might help explain at least some of the reason as to why some might commit murder while others might only fantasize about it. Talking about serial killers like Randy Kraft in particular, some of you have taken my forensic psych class, in which we spend a week talking about homicide, so we go in depth on serial killers. Others, you might know about serial killers from other classes or from just documentaries or reading or so on. What do you know about serial killers? What's some common background features, characteristics, motivations? What's some commonalities? What do you know about them?
Organized and disorganized.
Right, yeah. So there's a dichotomy by the FBI, right? That some are organized and some are disorganized. So the organized ones, they planned out the killing. They maybe stopped the victim beforehand. They planned out how they would get away with the crime. So they cleaned up after themselves. They didn't leave any evidence behind. They brought a weapon with them and took it away. And they were organized in other aspects of their life. That was what the FBI observed, that they could hold down a job, that they could even in many cases be married and have children and maintain friendships. Others were disorganized. They were more impulsive. They killed whenever they felt the urge to do so and it wasn't planned out. They used a weapon at the crime scene, one of opportunity. They didn't clean up after themselves. And they were disorganized in other aspects of their life. They couldn't hold down a job. They went from job to job to job. They were unable to have romantic relationships or maintain friendships. Their neighbors called them weird because they couldn't come across as being normal in the way that the organized ones could, right? So that was really the FBI led by John Douglas and Robert Ressler. It was really in the 1970s that the public began getting interested in serial killers. And Robert Ressler and John Douglas put together the FBI's behavioral analyst unit. And they began by interviewing serial killers all over the country to find what were the common characteristics, what were the motivations. And that was something that they observed, this dichotomy. If you've seen the Netflix show Mindhunter, that's based upon those events. Right? The main character is based on John Douglas. What else do you know about serial killers? What else?
I know that they're categorized into like different like types sometimes, like I can't remember all of them, but I know some of them are vigilantes or sadistic.
Right, okay.
or-
So there's the Holmes and Holmes motivation model.
Yeah.
So we'll come to that, yeah, but that's another way of classifying them. Yeah. What else do you know? So there's varying motivations. I'm sure there's lots of things you know. You have good childhoods, most cases. No, it's usually pretty horrific, right? usually extremely traumatic. There's usually lots of abuse in the backgrounds of these cases. And usually there's cases of cruelty against animals. That's very, very common in cases of serial killers when they were children, right? A way of releasing their anger. Their parents are abusing them. They can't fight back against their parents. Here's a helpless animal that I can torture instead and let out my rage on. And fire starting is also quite a common childhood behavior. What else?
Sometimes it's, they have a specific person in mind that they want to kill, but they end up like, they think they're not ready for it. So what sometimes happens that they end up, killing other people that looks similar to that person, and so they get ready to kill the actual person.
Right, exactly. They often have surrogates. There's usually a real target of their age, quite often an ex, a mother, and they choose people who remind them of that person, right? Ted Bundy, right? Targeted brunettes who reminded him of an ex, so much so that brunette wigs, blonde wigs rather, went out of sale, right, all over California, because brunette women wanted to wear blonde wigs because they were so afraid of the Ted Bundy cases. So yeah, usually there's a real target in mind, and usually they select surrogates. What else? Quite often there's a MO, modus operandi, way in which they commit the kill, so it's the same every time, right? They know how they're going to do it, they've maybe thought about it to some extent, or it happens in one way the first time, and then they do it that way again, and maybe the MO advances, right? Nathaniel Code was a serial killer who used what was at the scene to strangle his first victim, and then he brought equipment with him for the subsequent kills, to tie the victim and so on, okay? So the MO was more nailed down the more they did it, okay? But they have a pattern, right, of how they're going to commit the crime. Sometimes there's a signature, right, which is overkill, something beyond what's needed to commit the crime. Okay? Some sort of identifier, right, that they can, in part, they can sometimes lead to them, them being caught, because you can then track which kills they committed. Anything else? Well, one definition of serial killing is that it's the killing of 3 or more people over a period of more than 30 days with a significant cooling off period. There's multiple definitions, okay, but what they all have in common is that they try to separate it from mass killing, okay? Mass killing is killing many people at one point in time in one place. Okay? Serial killing has a cooling off period between kills. Okay. For serial killing, what the serial killers report is a build-up of tension, and then once they committed their kill, they were relieved of this tension, and then there was a build-up again, okay, until they felt an overwhelming need to kill again. Okay. For most experts in this field, they call it sexual murder. Okay. Even if it's not the case that they sexually assault the victim, or that there's any evidence of sexual arousal at the time of the killing, it's very often a substitute for sex. Okay? Quite often there isn't any penetration. Quite often serial killers are impotent. Okay? And quite often it's a substitute, okay? But it's sexual energy that's basically being relieved, okay, during the act of violence. Now, most serial killers do not meet the benchmark of legal insanity. They know what they're doing, and they know what they're doing is wrong, okay? But they still report it as being this kind of overwhelming urge, okay, that they felt a need to kill, and they couldn't quite describe it themselves, okay? You know, they describe a motivating, driving force that even they can't really explain. You know, when Dennis Nielsen was arrested for killing those 16 men in England, you know, he was asked why he did it. First thing he said to police was, "I was hoping you could tell me why I did it." Okay? And the interviews with serial killers by FBI also revealed they really had no idea why they were actually doing this. it's repetitive, okay, like I say, there's an MO, okay, that they're living out. Sometimes they take with them a trophy, which is maybe a belonging of the victim. Sometimes something more disturbing, like a body part or some hair. Something that they can then use to help enrich their fantasies, okay? So they can prolong the need to kill again. Okay? They can then use that during the cooling off period for fantasizing. The killing is usually one-on-one, right? It's usually one offender, one victim. Okay, again, separating it from mass killing. And usually the victim is unknown, especially for organized killers. Like Liz said, it could be a substitute. Usually the victim is not known to the perpetrator. About 86% are male, about 14% are female. Motivation differs. Female serial killers less likely to be excited by the killing, more likely to be motivated by financial gain. So the Black Widow type is the most common female serial killer who, you know, marries a wealthy man, kills him to get the inheritance, and then maybe repeats that. Yeah. The angel of death, the killing nurse. Okay, that's another quite common type of female serial killer. Socioeconomic status varies. Okay, again, the more organized they are, the more likely they are to have basic education, a steady job, steady income, than if they're disorganized. The majority are white. Okay, over 81% are white. That's different from general homicide. In general homicide, close to 50% are white and close to 50% are African American. Okay. Serial killing is the exception. Okay. The vast majority of perpetrators are white. 61% exclusively target strangers. I want to show a 10-minute video, okay, with a forensic psychologist interviewing Richard Kaczynski. Anyone know who that is? Also known as the Iceman. He was a hitman for the mob, and he would freeze the victims in ice after killing them, so it was harder to determine the time of death. Okay. The psychologist's interview with him is pretty good. Okay, if you can watch it all on YouTube. But I want to just show this 10 minutes because it goes quite in depth on the psychopathic features, okay, that we're going to talk about.
Well, why don't we turn the tables here and you interview me? I'll answer your questions.
Interesting. Just so happens I might have a question for you.
Why did you decide to talk to me?
Well, basically, I think I decided to talk to you would be so I could find out more about myself, since I don't know the answers. And you are a person who is highly qualified to give me answers, possibly of what's going on. I figured this would be a good time to talk to somebody like you, or you know.
Well, why don't we turn the tables here and you interview me? I'll answer your questions.
Interesting. I could live with that. Just so happens I might have a question for you. What do you think about me? Anything good, better, and different?
Yeah, some of each. The issues about your behavior, I think there are really a couple things to say. The things that I'm most sure of, based on the information you've told me, are that your principal problem has been a warp in your personality. And we classify personality according to different types. And there are two types of personality features that you have a great deal of. The first of them is called antisocial personality disorder. What it refers to behaviorally is someone who does not have a conscience, does not have remorse, does not feel a sense of guilt about most of the bad things they do, is impulsive and violent. The typical things we see before age 15 in people who earn that label are cruelty toward animals, cruelty toward people. And an awfully interesting part of that condition is that we've got a little bit of knowledge of what causes it and where it comes from. And that's where there's some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that part of where that comes from is hereditary. That there's a genetic basis to being a fearless person. And you've told me about how rarely you have any experience that even begins to resemble nervousness or fear. It takes extreme things to make you have a sense of impending danger. Normal people get fearful about a wide variety of things frequently and would be beside themselves with the kinds of experiences that you had on a weekly basis. You couldn't have done the things you did if you were capable of ordinary fear. But the fact that you're born with a genetic predisposition to fearlessness doesn't mean that it's inevitable for you to become a criminal. Because some people who have that genetic predisposition to fearlessness become pro-social risk takers. They do things like drive race cars, test fly planes, fighter pilots, bomb disposal technicians. Now, those are all jobs where it helps to have a lot of fearlessness. And in fact, some people in law enforcement are brave and have that same capacity to be fearless. And the difference between the people who grow up to be risk-taking good guys with white hats and the people who grow up to be risk-taking bad guys with a long, long rap sheet and a lot of crimes has to do with how their parents raised them. If you raise a kid with love and kindness and affection most of the time, you've got a good shot at their growing up to be decent, caring, loving human beings and treating their own kids well. But if you raise a kid the way Stanley raised you, with no love, no affection, constant abuse, beatings for no reason, all you teach is hatred. You make it impossible for that child to grow up and form strong attachments and loving, caring relationships, or to be willing to risk themselves to protect the world. So I think you got to be this kind of antisocial psychopathic person, both by getting Stanley's genes and having Stanley's parenting and your mother's cold, standoffish way of treating you. In other words, that part of you was both born and made. But your own kids and your own grandchildren will turn out according to how you and Barbara raised them, despite whatever genetic influence there may be. The other thing that I think is true about you is another personality style, where I think it's fair to say that you've got the features of what we call a paranoid personality disorder. the general rule for someone who is paranoid is to trust no one. Let no one get too close to you. And to never forgive anyone who does you wrong. If somebody criticizes them, they're quick to respond with anger or to counterattack. If somebody humiliates them, then they must have revenge. About 1 to 2% of the population has the paranoid personality disorder. About 2 to 3% of males and 1% of females have the antisocial personality disorder. And then there's this smaller group that has both. And it was having both that allows you to have this career that you've had, and that allows you to profit from your capacity for a completely emotionless, fearless, remorseless hit. By being free of any conscience and also free of friends and of people who could bring you down, you were able to have a very long run as a successful contract killer, which is quite unusual. And you wouldn't have been able to do that had you not had both of those personality flaws. In your line of work, they turned out to be major advantages and preconditions for a successful career.
I appreciate you taking the time explaining this to me. I am probably the loneliest person in the world because I have nothing I care for, and I can't make any friends to have any kind of a relationship so I've lost everything. I've lost everything I ever cared for, everything I ever wanted. It's down the toilet. Since there is no love in my life, I must have something to replace it, so I replace it with hate. Constant hate, constant reminder to hate.
What's that do for you?
Keeps my left foot going in front of my right foot. Keeps me moving. Without it, I would probably just drop down someplace and have no reason to continue.
Is that all you've got left is hate?
So I've got left. Everything that I ever cared for is gone. Everything I ever liked is gone. Everything that meant anything to me is gone. So hate.
That's all you started with too.
Then I've come full circle. It's time for me to die.
We have time at the end, I'll show you this other 3-minute snippet. The mood kind of shifts. It takes some offense to something the psychologist says, and you can see they're triggered and it's now getting a bit angry. Things might be quite different if they weren't in a room with cameras and guards. In terms of the age breakdown for serial killers, you can see most are 20s to 30s. Male serial killers typically begin killing in their mid to late 20s. Female serial killers usually a bit later, usually early 30s. 73% kill locally, smaller in the regional area, smaller group still nationwide. The more organized they are, the further they go from home, right? The more disorganized ones kill close to where they live. And that's why geographical profiling is sometimes used in investigations, right? In geographical profiling, you on a map pinpoint all the killing sites, and then once you have enough of them, you can form some sort of circle, and it's reasonable that the killer will be somewhere near the nucleus of that. And those who kill nationwide you know, they might have a job that allows them to do that, like a job as a truck driver or in sales, something that allows them to travel. And then when they're far from home is when they'll take the opportunity to kill. And there's a book by Fox and Levin in which they have collected data on all of the convicted serial killers in America up to that point when it was published in 2005, about 105 years to look at of convicted American serial killers, okay? We meet the definition of at least 3 kills over a cooling off period in between each one. They identify 558, okay? Nearly 500 of which killed solo as individuals. The remaining 60-ish killed as part of a partnership. Female serial killers are more likely to be in a partnership than male serial killers. The partnership could be a cult, like the Manson family. It could be that the female is aiding in some way, helping the male get away with the crime, that they're not actually the one motivated to kill. They might be luring out victims for their boyfriends, their killer boyfriends, and then helping dispose of the body afterwards. Or they could be a sadistic couple, like Kamala and Paul Bernardo from Canada, who killed multiple young women. Both sexual sadists, okay, who were both motivated to kill, but they're rare cases. The book also argues, first of all, how many victims have these 600-ish people claimed? Well, 3,800 to 5,700. They based that upon crimes they were convicted for and those that were highly probable, okay? There's always an open question with serial killers, how many victims are there really, okay? And there's some range. This is based upon those that they were actually convicted for and those that were highly probable. Okay? That means that each serial killer, on average, it was somewhere between 8 and 11 victims. Okay? Now, the book also argues that serial killing is a growing issue because they identify basically none in the first 50 years of the previous century, increase in the 1960s, massive increase in the 70s, and then even greater increase as the decades go on. So in comparing the number between 1975 and 1992, that's 4 times as many as there was between 1960 and 1974. The obvious counterpoint to this is that it was easier to detect serial killers, okay, as time went on. It's not necessarily clear that the number increased. The fact is there has always been serial killers, okay? As we look back in history, there's always been sexual murderers. There's always been those who were sexually excited by violence and killing. As the years went on, states shared more information with each other, agencies improved, databases became more advanced, and so on. That all made it easier to detect serial killers, right? Forensic science also improved, of course, DNA testing and so on. You know, we're at a point now in which DNA testing is so advanced, the investigators don't need your DNA on file if you leave DNA at the crime scene. They only need the DNA of a distant relative, even a distant cousin can be enough to find you. And we're at a point now, really, when there's so many cold cases being solved, like never before, okay? Many cold cases that were thought to have never been solved, okay, are now getting solved because of the DNA testing improvements. And we're really at a point when, you know, if you leave DNA at a scene, you're going to get caught. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So you would expect, I think, that we're at a turning point now. Probably over the upcoming years, there'll be a massive decline in serial killings because these sorts of crimes will be much harder to commit. Another typing system is the Holmes and Holmes model, okay, that's based upon motivation, okay. There's a video on Canvas you can check out that I put up that gives video examples for each of these. But this argues there's different types of motivations. The first is visionary. Okay, so they're motivated by visions, hearing voices that are telling them to kill, seeing visions telling them to kill. Something psychotic. This is the offender who's most likely mentally ill, psychologically disturbed, having some sort of psychotic break, right? They're having hallucinations. We talked about Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, right? Who believed or claimed that God spoke to him in the graveyard and told him to kill prostitutes, right? So that would be an example of a visionary killer. There was the vampire of Sacramento, California, who believed his blood was running out, turning to a powder. He had to kill and drink the blood of victims to replenish his blood. That would be another example of a psychotic explanation. Right. The second is mission-orientated. Those who kill because of a sense of duty or a mission that they feel compelled to live out, and they feel some sort of righteousness to fulfill it. Okay. So it could be targeting prostitutes and homosexuals because one views them as sinful or because they want to clean up the streets. There's been serial killers who targeted interracial couples, couples who were, mixed race because they thought it was a crime against God, or couples that were Jew and non-Jew because they thought it was a crime against God. Okay, again, feeling some sort of righteousness, okay, in what they're doing. Then there's the hedonistic type that really has 3 subtypes to it. Okay, the lust type, who's attracted to the victim and sexually aroused by the act of killing. The thrill-seeking type, who's stimulation-seeking and is excited by the act of killing, but it's the adrenaline rush that they're chasing. It's not actually sexually arousing. And then the comfort killer, who kills for financial gain. Thrill-seeking, lust, motivation. These are by far the most common motivations for male serial killers. Okay. Comfort, not so much. That's rare for male serial killers. There's some cases. There's been cases in which there were male serial killers who, would target wealthy families, often retired wealthy people, and then they would live in their home and use all of their resources, take whatever money they had, and then once they thought they might get caught, they'd move on to some other victims. This is more common for female serial killers, right? This is where the Black Widow type would fall under. And then there's power control serial killers who kill because they want to prove their dominance, their control over others. They have some fantasy that they want to live out to prove how powerful they are. Strangulation is the most common mode of killing for this last type. With strangulation, you're actually having control over the victim's last breath, right? And having control over life and death. These individuals were often abused as children and felt powerless. Okay? And their fantasies of having power over others began early in life. Okay? They can't fight back against their abuser. They can fantasize about killing their abuser. And then that becomes their go-to coping strategy when they're stressed or feeling humiliated or threatened. They fantasize about killing that person and then feeling powerful. Even after conviction in prison, serial killers have fantasies as their most common coping mechanism. Unlike other offenders, they're less likely to seek out social support or to use substances to deal with their anxieties or frustrations or stress. They're more likely to fantasize about things being better than being more powerful. Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Nielsen, good examples of power control killers. They killed men they were attracted to, but they killed when they felt as though they were about to be abandoned and they didn't want to be left. Now, this typing system has a lot of issues. Okay. First of all, it can be difficult to classify objectively a particular offender. So Peter Sutcliffe, for example, I told you about, I classed him as visionary because the origins of the motivation were the delusions from the paranoid schizophrenia. But he was killing prostitutes because he believed it was sinful. You could argue he was mission-orientated. Okay? So it becomes difficult to label one motivation. Almost all serial killers kill for power and control. Okay, no matter what the other reasons are, because usually there's multiple reasons. That's part of it. Okay, there's a power control element almost always. So to have this as a separate type is also not entirely helpful. Well, I think this model we can make more sense of by looking at motivation as falling on one of two spectrums, using what we know from this class. One spectrum would be the schizophrenia spectrum for mental illness. You would expect both the first and second type to be high on this spectrum, right? And then the other type and subtypes are really examples of psychopaths, right, who just score differently on the different factors. You know, the lust and thrill seeking or stimulation seeking, right? The comfort is willing to leech off others. The power control is grandiose or wants to prove their grandiosity, right? It's all facets of psychopathy, right? Okay, here's a cheery question for you, okay? Some serial killers eat their victim's body, okay? Based upon what I've just told you about the causes of serial killing and the motivations, why do you think they might do that?
Like their trophy, it's another way of keeping the victim close to them.
Okay, yeah, okay. Some psychotic way, keeping close to them, yeah.
Sometimes, serial killers, kill because they want to know how it feels to kill. So it could be possible that they also just want to, like, I mean, if you have the mindset of wanting to know what it feels like to kill someone, I wouldn't like pass it by if they want to know what it tastes like.
Yeah, okay. Some bizarre curiosity. It could be tied to the psychotic delusions, like in the Sacramento case I told you about. It could be, you know, going back to that point of wanting to feel close to them in some, you know, delusional way. That's a way of being close, a way of having power over them as well, right? It's one way, one bizarre way of thinking about it. Yeah. There's a good paper by Alley and colleagues. It goes in depth on over 200 killers, serial killers and mass killers, doing case studies, okay, going in depth on their backgrounds, looking for the most common background features, okay, and they find three, okay, psychosocial stress, head injuries, and autism, okay. So you can see about 50 to 60 to 70 fall within each of these. Then some have two of the features or all three. Okay. So psychosocial stress refers to anything that disrupts typical psychosocial development. Okay. Some traumatic experience early in life. It could be abuse, neglect, abandonment, the death of a loved one, whatever might be traumatizing in some way, that then has a negative impact on your social personality development early on, right? Your empathy development and so on. Yeah. The second one is head injuries. If you look at cases of serial killers, you will be incredibly surprised by the overwhelming number that have traumatic brain injuries. Okay. Whether it's bizarre accidents, from playground accidents, biking accidents, car accidents, to results of abuse. Quite often it's in hand with this one, right? In which they were physically abused and there was some traumatic brain injury as a result. And then the researchers also argue that many serial killers would fall high on the autism spectrum, okay? That they have either Asperger's or an autism disorder. The features of autism most common were preferring solitude over company of others, difficulty bonding with others, but also quite narrow interests and ritualistic behaviors. Okay. Now, the paper is worth reading. I can, in the lecture, go over all of it, okay, but I want to give a couple of case study examples from the paper. just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the cases. Killed 17 men, boys between 1978 and 1991. The series Dahmer on Netflix is a pretty good source of insight, okay, into what happened in this case. So the researchers lay out evidence for him being high in autism, social skills, deficits that were apparent early in life, difficulty expressing himself, communicating with others. People found it very difficult to talk to him, okay, those who knew him. Felt great difficulty getting emotional closeness or feeling a bond with other people, okay? Again, as a child and as an adult looking for relationships. Was a loner for most of his life, unable to make close friends. He had great difficulty reading body language, facial expressions, non-verbal communication. It was mostly a mystery for him. And those who talked to him reported an unusual gaze, okay? He couldn't maintain eye contact in conversations. Instead, he would fixate on something, and his eye would seem to be, staring at something during the conversation. And bodily awkwardness, that he didn't really feel in tune with his body, that he was very much in his own head, wasn't really paying attention to his environment, wasn't very observational, wasn't really in tune with his senses and the needs of his body. Yeah. And then repetitive thinking, behavior, interests. As a child, very narrow interests that he would talk about. He would stuff roadkill with his dad. That was their hobby. Yeah. And that was something he wanted to talk about obsessively. Yeah. Even as an adult, very narrow interests, okay, and repetitive thoughts. The same fantasies, always on loop in his head, okay. And then plenty of evidence of psychosocial stress. Frequent fighting between his parents. Now, arguments between parents is normal, but you would hope that children would learn successful, healthy coping or conflict resolution, rather, from watching their parents. Certainly, if parents are extremely verbally abusing one another constantly, that's a big risk factor for anxiety, depression for the child. It can make the home feel unsafe. His mother was severely depressed after giving birth, had suicidal thoughts, probably a pretty extreme postpartum depression. Okay. And his father was mainly absent and was pretty cold and aloof when he was around. He nearly died from a traumatizing surgery because of double hernia when he was a child. His father claims that he was sexually abused by a neighbor when he was 6. Dahmer at one point denied this, so that's a bit unclear whether that is part of the puzzle or not. And then he was undeniably frustrated by his homosexuality because he kept it secret for most of his life and felt ashamed as though he couldn't tell people he knew, again, especially his father. Another case is Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker. Killed 13 people between 1984 and 1985. He would walk the streets at night with a gun in his pocket, and if he saw someone walking alone and there was no one else on the street, he would take out his gun and shoot that person at the back of the head. In his background, we see evidence also of psychosocial stress. His father and grandfather were severely physically abusive. And then he also had an older cousin, sexual sadist, who was basically a serial killer also, but committed his crimes in Vietnam, so got away with them. There was many atrocities committed in Vietnam, okay, by some US troops. And Richard's older cousin was one of them. So his older cousin came back from war. The family was talking about how courageous and brave he was. He had served his family, right? This was someone to look up to. And then as Richard goes up to his older cousin's bedroom to talk to him about it, Richard is 7 years old. His older cousin shows him some photographs he took of the women he raped and tortured and murdered in Vietnam. Okay, the pictures he took of their mutilated bodies. Okay. confusing for a 7-year-old boy, right? This older cousin who you look up to, who everyone in the family is saying is a hero, okay, is telling you about how exciting it is and how amazing it is to torture women, right? When he was 12 years old, so 5 years later, he was staying at the house of that cousin. And when he was in the room, the cousin murdered his wife. Okay, so exposure there to extreme violence as well. And then plenty of evidence of head injury. His mother collapsed from chemicals at work when she was pregnant. And when he was 2, he nearly died from the bedroom dresser falling directly on his head. When he was 5, he was knocked unconscious when his sister jumped off the swing, and then the swing came back and smacked him on the head. And he had temporal lobe epilepsy, okay, probably as a result of the brain injury, okay, or multiple brain injuries. The researchers do not classify him as fitting in this red circle, okay, as being high enough on the autism spectrum. But they still point out some characteristics, that he was unable to form attachments as a child. He preferred his own company as a child rather than being around other people. Okay, what's your question so far? Okay. Talking now about mass killing. Okay. It's different from serial killing because it's 3 or more individuals again, but in one location. There's no cooling off period. It usually takes place over minutes or hours, right? This would be like school shootings, workplace shootings, the Charles Whitman case we looked at. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of examples. Okay, there's many, many locations in which these could occur. Now, there is an umbrella term called rampage killing that covers both mass killing and spree killing. Okay. Spree killing is different from mass killing because there's multiple locations. Again, there's no cooling off period, it's continuous, but the killer is moving from site to site. This would be like the case in Maine over the summer last year. Right? It began in a bowling alley, I believe, and then he moved to somewhere else and then to somewhere else again, kept on going until the police caught him. Right? This could take place over days or weeks. Now, psychologically, there's no real difference between mass killers and spree killers, okay? But they're both very different from serial killers. Yeah. They typically are white males with a pretty broad age range. Over the past 30 years, the average was 29. They feel a sense of being wronged, frustrated, depressed. Now, for serial killers also, they quite often report feeling as though they've been overlooked. They haven't been allowed to shine. They've been cast into the shadows. They report being a victim. Okay. But for mass killers, there's typically some triggering events, okay, or events that push them over the edge, whether it was a divorce, going bankrupt, losing one's job, a breakup, okay, something that had them feeling worthless. Life is no longer worth living. I'm going to go out and take as many people as I can with me. Okay. So they're typically unconcerned with their life. Okay. A big difference between them and serial killers. Serial killers usually want to keep on going as long as they can. Okay. Mass killers typically know this is the end. Okay. 23% of them commit suicide. Many more are killed by police, knowing that they'll likely be killed by police. In some cases, it's another form of suicide. Really, it's suicide by cop, right? In which you target a gun at a police officer, basically forcing them into shooting you. There's often a fascination with guns that goes well back. Some contemplation of the act. Average number of victims is about 5. Now, mass killing is something that's undeniably increasing, right? With serial killing, it's harder to determine if it really is. With mass killing, it's undeniable. There was only 4 mass killings in the entire 1950s. 1977 to 1991, about 269. You know, we're now at a point when there's nearly about 500 cases a year that could be classed as meeting the definition of mass killing in the US. Differences between teenage mass killers and adults. They'll both are likely to be loners, but even more so with adults. Fascination with guns, pretty common for both, even more so for adults. History of violence, sometimes, not usually. Substance abuse, more so with teenagers. Major depression, psychosis, yes, pretty common for both. And some triggering event, you know, very common for adults. It's something that happened beforehand, before the mass killing. For teenagers, yes, there could also be some triggering events, some humiliation. But quite often it's a series of events, okay, rather than one particular event. Adult mass killers know their victims about half the time, so it could be colleagues, other times it could be strangers. For teenagers, it's usually schools that they're targeting, so usually they know the victims. And because of that, also it's usually in the morning, right, early in the school day. For adults, it's usually in the afternoon. And the adults are more likely to commit suicide. Some changes over the years. The average age of mass killers seems to be increasing. The sex hasn't changed at all. Okay, it's pretty much only males who commit mass killings. The race is changing. It used to be the case that pretty much all mass killers were white. Now there's more variation in ethnicity.
Have they done a lot of research on why it's predominantly males that do a lot of mass shootings, or?
Not really. I mean, there's very few studies anyway on mass killers and serial killers. But the fact that 9 out of 10 violent offenders are male, the more extreme the form of violence, probably the greater the sex difference you would find. The number who are getting killed by police or committing suicide is also increasing, so the number of arrests is decreasing. The Columbine case is a case I talked about last time, probably the most well illustrated in books and movies of school shooting cases. I want to talk to you about a case, the case of Kip Kinkle. I briefly mentioned him last time, the Oregon example. Now, Kip Kinkle was not someone who wasn't known to be at risk, but he was. Had a fascination with guns, with violence. Teachers had reported concerns over the drawings that he was drawing in class, violent fantasies. He has got in trouble for stealing guns multiple times, including from the houses of friends. He got in trouble multiple times for having a knife on him. One time, a friend at school took this knife, and he responded by having what can only be described as a psychotic break. Grabbed that knife back and then chased his friend. His friend went into a classroom and shut the door, and he kept on smashing on the door until he had broken through. Okay. He went to therapy for his many behavioral issues. Okay, was on medication, was on Prozac for major depression. Eventually, he was taken out of therapy, and the medication was discontinued. We don't really know why. His parents died. Okay, so they're not around to fill in the blanks. Okay, but he was pulled from therapy. The medication discontinued. What we do know is during this time, his dad thought it was a good idea for his birthday to get him a semi-automatic gun for his birthday present. Okay. Knowing that there had been concerns from school over his violent fantasies, his physical altercations with other students, he had been in therapy, revealing disturbing information. He had just recently been taken off his medication. Okay, a great time to get him a gun. Now, the father wanted to bond with his son. Okay, the father had difficulty talking to him. They didn't really have any similar interests, and he felt as though he was not he was losing kind of closeness with his son. And the father was interested in guns and going to the shooting range, and he thought that might be a way of bonding with the son. Yeah. But still, buying the son his own gun at a time like this is irresponsible, right? And now it's being seen as criminal, okay? In the beginning of the year, it was the two parents who were arrested, right, for not securing their weapons at home enough, and the son used it to commit a school shooting, right? So now there's a precedent set okay, for parents to be imprisoned now, okay, for their children committing crimes like this, if they've neglected, okay, obvious signs or acted irresponsibly. Now, for Kip Kinko, the turning point was when he got into another fight at school. The school phoned his dad, and his dad had had enough and told him, "That's it, you're going to military camp. Okay, we're done with you." And as he was on the phone to the military camp, Kip Kinko got his gun and shot and killed his father. Okay. And then he waited for his mom to come back from work and killed her as well. Okay. And then decided the following morning he would go into school and shoot and kill as many people as he could. Okay. Odd detail, but you know, what do you do for 12 hours when you've just killed your parents and you're planning to end your life tomorrow and kill as many of your fellow students as you can? He put the soundtrack from Leonardo DiCaprio's Romeo and Juliet on loop, listened to it for 12 hours nonstop. That was how he passed the time. Okay. And then the next morning went into the school, committed the shooting that was stopped by police. Okay. During the trial, a number of features unearthed: clear learning disability. Okay. Even by 13, 14, he was still spelling his name wrong. Okay. We're talking about someone who is severely challenged mentally. Okay. Paranoid schizophrenia. There was a family history of schizophrenia that would also match up with the delusions that he was claiming. He would claim to have voices inside his head, and he would shout out, "Damn these voices in my head," things like that. Majorly depressed. And the frontal lobe, structurally impaired, a number of holes in the frontal lobe, and dysfunctional as well. Okay, both structurally impaired, functionally impaired. Now, based upon all of this, the prosecution worried that he might get a reduced sentence for diminished responsibility, and so they worked out a plea bargain with the defense. And in most cases, almost in all cases, plea bargains are accepted by judges, right? But in this case, no, the judge said, "We're not accepting a plea bargain, he's going to jail for over 100 years. Okay, and that's what happened. Okay, with no diminished responsibility taken into account. Any questions on anything we've covered so far? Okay, we have time, so I'll show you this quick 3-minute snippet from the other video.
You almost made me mad.
Yeah. What made you mad about that?
I don't know, but you almost did.
Can you figure out what it is?
No,
Try to look at it. Look at what made you mad there.
I don't know. I think it must have been something you said,
Yeah.
obviously, but I don't know what it was.
Could it be that I was challenging you and it sounded judgmental?
Could be. Yeah, that could be. Because you got me annoyed with you now.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
How mad are you?
I bet. Pretty. Feel a little flushed. So that means that I've reached the point in my life that I'm a little annoyed.
What would you like to do?
Doesn't matter. I don't think it's gone to the point that I'm actually gonna do anything stupid. Just curious to myself why it happened. I don't know why it happened. I'm actually almost glad it did happen because you had a chance to see something, but I don't know why it happened.
Did you feel I was criticizing you?
Yes,
Is that what did it?
I think so. I
Because
think that's the part that did it.
who used to criticize you the most?
Of course, my father.
Okay, thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time. So.